He thought leaving her without a seat would remind everyone who truly belonged in Willow Creek, but Richard Whitmore had no idea that the young woman he dismissed would soon make a choice that changed the entire neighborhood. The annual Willow Creek summer dinner unfolded beneath strings of warm lights on the community lawn, surrounded by stone homes, trimmed hedges, polished SUVs, and conversations about vacations, renovations, and private schools. At 25, Emily Carter looked almost out of place among them. Her light blue dress was simple, her brown hair rested naturally around her shoulders, and the peach cobbler she carried had been baked that afternoon in the small cottage she rented at the end of Hawthorne Lane. She had lived there for 11 months, long enough to recognize almost every face, but apparently not long enough for everyone to recognize her as one of them. Richard moved between the tables greeting homeowners with practiced confidence. At 52, he was one of Willow Creek's most influential residents, the kind of man people consulted before changing a fence or planning a neighborhood event. When Emily approached the main table, a woman beside Richard glanced at her and asked, "Who is she?" Richard barely looked up. "She rents the little place at the end of Hawthorne." Emily heard every word. She waited for him to add her name. He did not. Instead, he continued discussing seating arrangements. Emily quietly placed her cobbler beside the desserts and noticed an empty chair near the center of the table. "Is anyone sitting here?" she asked. Richard finally looked directly at her. His smile was polite enough to hide the insult from anyone who was not paying attention. "Those seats are reserved for homeowners tonight. We have additional seating near the side tables." For a moment, Emily said nothing. Nearby conversations softened. Nobody openly laughed. Nobody defended her either. That silence hurt more than cruelty would have. Emily looked at the empty chair, then at Richard. "I understand," she said. Her voice was calm. She carried her plate toward a smaller table near the edge of the lawn. Behind her, conversation slowly resumed, as if nothing important had happened. Richard believed the matter was finished. To him, rules were rules, and Willow Creek had always valued order. Yet Emily noticed things Richard did not. She noticed Mrs. Patterson struggling to carry 2 drinks and immediately helped her. She noticed an older neighbor sitting alone and brought him a slice of cobbler. She noticed the catering staff running short on napkins and quietly found another package without being asked. She did not perform kindness for attention. That was precisely why almost nobody noticed it. Later, as twilight settled over Willow Creek, Richard raised his glass and spoke about community, tradition, and protecting what made their neighborhood special. Emily listened from the edge of the gathering. Her eyes moved from the beautiful houses to the people sitting beneath the lights, separated by tables that seemed to say more than anyone intended. She did not know that within days those same neighbors would be standing together in uncertainty, waiting for someone to stop talking and start helping. And when that moment came, the woman who had not been considered worthy of a chair would be the first person willing to make room for everyone. The morning after the dinner, Emily woke before sunrise to the quiet hum of her refrigerator and the soft tapping of tree branches against the kitchen window. Her cottage at the end of Hawthorne Lane was less than 900 square feet, small by Willow Creek standards, but she had made every corner feel like home. A second-hand wooden table stood beneath the window. 3 herbs grew in chipped ceramic pots above the sink. Her light blue work blouse hung neatly over the back of a chair while coffee brewed beside a stack of papers from the nonprofit food pantry where she worked as a coordinator. Emily had learned long ago that a modest life did not have to feel like an unfinished one. She paid her bills on time, kept enough savings for emergencies, called her mother every Sunday, and spent most weekdays helping families who were facing problems far larger than an awkward seating arrangement. Still, Richard's words from the night before followed her into the morning. "She rents the little place at the end of Hawthorne. Not Emily. Not our neighbor. Just the renter in the small house." She poured coffee into a travel mug and looked through the window. Across the street, sprinklers swept over a lawn so perfectly trimmed it looked painted. Farther down, Richard's large brick home caught the first orange light of sunrise. His driveway held two polished vehicles, either one probably worth more than everything Emily owned. She did not envy him. What bothered her was simpler. He had decided that ownership made some people more worthy of belonging than others. At 7:15, Emily carried her bag outside and climbed into her 12-year-old silver sedan. Mrs. Patterson, a 74-year-old widow who lived 3 houses away, was struggling to pull a recycling bin back from the curb. Emily parked again, walked over, and rolled it up the driveway for her. "You are going to make yourself late," Mrs. Patterson said. "I have 6 minutes to spare," Emily replied with a smile. "Then I owe you 6 minutes someday. I will keep track." They both laughed. From his driveway, Richard noticed the exchange while checking something on his phone. Emily raised a hand in greeting. Richard gave a brief nod before getting into his vehicle. By 8 o'clock, Emily was 20 minutes away at the food pantry, checking delivery lists, answering calls, and helping organize boxes for families arriving that afternoon. Nobody there cared whether she owned property. They cared whether she remembered that one client needed low-sodium food, whether another had transportation, and whether the shelves would last through Friday. Emily was good at noticing what people needed before they had to ask twice. That evening, she returned to Willow Creek carrying 2 grocery bags and found several neighbors talking near a mailbox cluster. Their conversation stopped just long enough for her to feel it. One woman smiled politely. Another said hello. Then they returned to discussing an upcoming homeowners association meeting. Emily walked past them before stopping. "Is that meeting Thursday?" she asked. Richard, standing near the center of the group, looked surprised that she had spoken. "Yes, but most of the agenda concerns property owners." Emily held his gaze. "There is a community parcel behind the pavilion. I have an idea for it." Richard slipped his phone into his pocket. "You can send the board an email." "I already did." A small silence followed. Richard clearly had not expected that answer. Emily smiled politely and continued toward her cottage. Behind her, the conversation resumed, but something had shifted. The woman they'd barely noticed had stopped waiting to be noticed. Thursday evening arrived with the heavy warmth of late summer, and by 7 o'clock nearly 20 Willow Creek residents had gathered inside the community pavilion. Emily entered quietly and chose a chair near the back, carrying a thin folder beneath one arm. Richard sat at the front beside 2 other homeowners association board members, dressed in a pressed white shirt with his reading glasses resting beside a leather notebook. For 40 minutes, the meeting moved through landscaping contracts, mailbox repairs, parking reminders, and plans to replace several decorative lights near the entrance. Emily listened without interrupting. Finally, Richard glanced at the final page of the agenda. "We have one community use proposal submitted by Emily Carter." It was the first time Emily had heard him say her full name. Several people turned toward her. "Would you like to explain it?" Richard asked. Emily stood and walked toward the front. "The parcel behind this pavilion is empty most of the year," she said. "I would like to organize a quarterly food drive there, along with a small emergency supply collection for flashlights, batteries, bottled water, and basic household items." A woman near the window nodded with interest. Emily opened her folder. "The nonprofit where I work can provide collection bins and coordinate pickup. Nothing would be stored here permanently. Volunteers would manage everything, and the association would not need to pay for the program." Richard folded his hands. "I read your email. Then you know it would only use the space 4 Saturdays a year. I understand the proposal." His tone remained courteous, almost warm, which somehow made what followed feel colder. "But Willow Creek has always been careful about how common property is used. Once we begin turning residential space into a collection site, we create expectations that may be difficult to manage." Emily looked around the pavilion. It would be a few hours every 3 months. One board member shifted in his chair. Richard continued. "There are already charities in town designed for that purpose. I work for one of them." "Exactly. And I think those organizations should continue doing what they do well." Emily understood what he meant without his having to say it directly. Helping people was acceptable somewhere else. Willow Creek simply did not need to see it. The supplies would also be useful here during an outage or severe weather, Emily said. Richard gave a small smile. Most residents are capable of preparing their own homes. A few people nodded. Emily looked at the polished floor, the locked storage room, and the large windows overlooking the unused parcel behind the pavilion. Then she looked back at Richard. So that is your answer? I believe this neighborhood should remain residential. That is what this neighborhood is for. The room became still. Emily closed her folder but did not sit down. Then what is a neighborhood for? Richard's expression changed slightly. Nobody moved. Emily did not raise her voice. If living beside people does not include noticing when someone needs help, what exactly are we protecting? The questions settled over the room. Richard removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the table. We are protecting standards that every homeowner agreed to. Emily nodded once. I understand. She returned to her chair without another argument. The board voted against the proposal minutes later. When the meeting ended, neighbors gathered their papers and walked toward expensive cars beneath a sky beginning to cloud over. Richard locked the pavilion door and slipped the key into his pocket. Emily crossed the parking area toward her old silver sedan. A low rumble of thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. Richard glanced toward the darkening horizon, then back at the locked gate beside the pavilion. For the moment, it was only weather approaching. Neither of them yet understood how soon Willow Creek would have to answer Emily's question. By Friday afternoon, the clouds that had gathered beyond Willow Creek had thickened into a dark gray ceiling, and the weather alerts on Emily's phone warned of severe thunderstorms moving through the county that evening. At the food pantry, she spent the final hour of her shift helping secure outdoor collection bins and checking that emergency flashlights were stored where volunteers could reach them if the building lost power. It was ordinary preparation, the kind of work Emily had learned mattered most before anyone believed it would matter. She left shortly after 5 and drove toward Willow Creek beneath a sky flashing occasionally in the distance. Rain began as she turned onto Hawthorne Lane. Within 20 minutes, it was falling hard enough to blur the windows of her cottage. Emily changed into comfortable clothes, charged her phone, filled 2 pitchers with water, and placed a flashlight on the kitchen counter. Across the street, Richard stood inside his large front window speaking on his phone while the lights from his home glowed warmly behind him. Then, shortly after 7, the entire street went dark. Air conditioners stopped humming. Porch lights disappeared. The neighborhood fell into an unfamiliar silence before backup lights and flashlights began appearing through windows. Emily checked her phone. The utility company's outage map showed thousands of customers without power. A message in the neighborhood group said a large tree had fallen across one of the main roads leading out of Willow Creek, and local crews were already responding. There was no immediate emergency, but nobody knew how long restoration would take. Emily pulled on a rain jacket and stepped outside once the heaviest rain had passed. Several adults were gathering near the mailbox cluster. Richard was already there, holding his phone above shoulder height as if another 12 inches might improve the signal. The utility company says crews are assessing the area, he told everyone. We should remain at home and wait for updates. Mrs. Patterson lives alone, Emily said. Richard looked toward her. I am sure she is fine. I would rather know. Emily walked 3 houses down and knocked. Mrs. Patterson answered with a flashlight in one hand. She was safe, but her phone battery was nearly empty, and she was worried about medication that needed to remain cool. Emily promised they would find a solution if the outage continued. When she returned, the group had grown. One neighbor had a portable power station. Another had extra coolers. Someone else had bottled water. The problem was not a lack of resources. It was that nobody knew who had what or who needed it. We need a list, Emily said. Richard frowned. A list of what? 3 things. Who needs help, who can help, and which homes have already been checked. A man near Richard nodded. That actually makes sense. Emily continued. We should use the pavilion. It is central, covered, and everyone knows where it is. Richard looked toward the dark community building about 200 yards away. The pavilion is locked. You have the key. The association cannot simply open common facilities during an outage without considering liability. Emily stared at him for a moment. Around them, neighbors shifted beneath umbrellas and waited. The same empty parcel Richard had defended from community use the night before now sat behind a locked gate while the community stood outside needing exactly what Emily had proposed. She looked toward Mrs. Patterson's dark house, then back at Richard. People do not need another meeting, she said quietly. They need somewhere to organize. Thunder rolled far beyond the neighborhood, softer now as the storm moved east. Richard tightened his grip around the pavilion key in his pocket, still thinking about regulations. Emily was already thinking about people. Emily watched Richard for several seconds as the neighbors waited beneath umbrellas and the damp evening air settled over Hawthorne Lane. The storm was moving away, but the darkness it had left behind made every familiar house look strangely uncertain. "Open the gate," Emily said. Richard looked toward the pavilion, then back at her. "Emily, there are procedures. For using association property, people need a central place to share information. I understand that, but if someone gets hurt or property is damaged, the association could be responsible." Emily did not argue with his concern. She simply looked toward Mrs. Patterson's house and then at the adults standing nearby with flashlights, coolers, chargers, and bottled water scattered among them. Everyone had something useful, yet nobody had a system. "Then I will start here," she said. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Emily turned and walked quickly toward her cottage. 5 minutes later, her silver sedan rolled slowly back toward the mailbox cluster. She opened the trunk and removed 2 flashlights, several packages of batteries, bottled water, a first aid kit, a portable phone charger, and a folding table she kept for food pantry events. She placed the table on the wide grassy area outside the locked pavilion gate. Then she found a large piece of cardboard in her trunk and wrote 3 headings with a black marker: "Need help, can help, checked on." The neighbors gathered closer. "If you need something, put your name and address here," Emily explained. "If you have something useful to share, write it here. If someone has checked on a household, we mark it here so we do not duplicate work or forget anyone." A man named Daniel stepped forward first. "I have a portable power station and 2 extension cords." Emily wrote it down. Another woman said, "We have 3 coolers and plenty of ice." Mrs. Patterson raised her hand slightly. "I may need one of those coolers for my medication." "Then that is our first match," Emily said. Within minutes, the cardboard began filling with names. A retired nurse named Linda volunteered to check on older residents who might need assistance. Another neighbor offered battery lanterns. Someone had a gas grill that could be used outdoors the next morning if the outage continued and refrigerated food needed to be cooked safely. Emily assigned nothing by authority. She simply connected one offer to one need, then another. Richard stood several feet away, watching the neighborhood organize itself around a folding table outside a facility he still refused to open. His phone suddenly seemed less important. "We should not have people walking around unnecessarily in the dark," he said. Emily nodded. "Agreed. Nobody goes alone and nobody enters a home unless invited. We stay on the sidewalks and check only nearby houses." Richard looked at the list. She had already considered the obvious risks. "You do this often?" he asked. At the pantry, organization matters more than good intentions. Another neighbor arrived carrying a box of flashlights. The folding table was becoming crowded. Emily glanced through the locked gate at the covered pavilion sitting empty only 20 feet away. Rainwater dripped steadily from its roof. "We could do this better in there," she said. Richard followed her gaze. His hand moved toward his pocket. Inside it was the same key he had used after Thursday's meeting, when he had told Emily that Willow Creek did not need the kind of community space she imagined. Now the neighborhood stood before him proving otherwise. For the first time, Richard was not deciding whether Emily belonged in Willow Creek. He was deciding whether his pride belonged there more than she did. Richard stood beside the locked gate while another neighbor added her name beneath "Can help." For years, he had believed leadership meant anticipating problems, protecting standards, and preventing disorder before it began. Yet standing there in the dark, he could not ignore what was happening in front of him. Emily had created order without authority, cooperation without a committee, and trust without asking anyone to prove that they belonged. He finally reached into his pocket. The small metal key caught the beam of a flashlight as he held it between his fingers. Emily noticed, but said nothing. Richard walked toward the gate, unlocked it, and pulled it open. "Bring the table inside," he said. Nobody applauded. Nobody needed to. Within minutes, the covered pavilion became exactly what Emily had imagined at Thursday's meeting. Lanterns appeared on tables. Bottled water was arranged along one wall. Coolers were labeled so nobody accidentally took medication or food belonging to someone else. Emily moved the cardboard list to a dry table near the entrance and began transferring the information onto several sheets of paper. Richard watched her work. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The question surprised both of them. Emily looked toward the neighborhood map hanging inside the pavilion. "You know the homeowners better than I do. Mark every house where someone lives alone, then we can make sure each one has been checked." Richard hesitated at the word homeowners, perhaps hearing it differently now. Then he picked up a marker. "Mrs. Patterson is here. Mr. Harris lives alone on Brookfield. The Carsons are out of town." "Good," Emily said. "Mark them." Soon the pavilion filled with purposeful conversation. Daniel connected his portable power station so Mrs. Patterson could charge her phone while her medication remained protected in a cooler with ice. Linda, the retired nurse, volunteered to accompany another neighbor to check on Mr. Harris. 2 residents offered extra battery lanterns. Another family brought unopened cases of water from their garage. Emily kept the system simple. Nobody was ordered to do anything. People offered what they had, and she helped match it to someone who needed it. Richard gradually stopped standing apart. He carried supplies, updated addresses, and called out information from the neighborhood directory. At one point, a man entered the pavilion and looked around at the organized tables. "Who is running this?" he asked. Richard opened his mouth, then paused. Only a few days earlier, he had introduced Emily as the woman who rented the little place at the end of Hawthorne. Now he looked across the pavilion at her light blue rain jacket, damp hair, and handwritten lists. "Emily Carter started this," he said. "Follow her system." Emily looked up. Their eyes met across the room. Richard gave a small nod. It was not an apology, but it was the first time his respect had arrived before his pride. Around 10 o'clock, an update came through that utility crews expected restoration work to continue through the night. The fallen tree was being cleared, and residents were advised to remain in the neighborhood unless necessary. Emily repeated the information so everyone understood there was no reason to panic. One by one, people began returning home after confirming that nearby households had been checked. Richard remained behind to help straighten the tables. When only a few neighbors were left, he looked at the cardboard sign Emily had made outside the gate. "Need help. Can help. Checked on." 3 simple columns had accomplished more in 2 hours than the association had accomplished through 40 minutes of debate. "You were right about the space," he said quietly. Emily folded one of the lists. The space was never the important part. Richard looked around the pavilion. What was? Emily glanced toward the open gate, where neighbors were walking home together beneath a clearing sky. Opening it. Richard said nothing. The room went quiet, and for once, the man who had always believed he understood what made Willow Creek valuable was beginning to understand what he had nearly kept outside. By sunrise, Willow Creek looked different. The storm clouds had moved east, leaving wet pavement, scattered leaves, and a pale morning sky above the quiet houses. Power had not yet returned to every street, but the uncertainty of the night had faded into something more organized. The pavilion doors remained open. Coffee arrived in insulated containers from a neighbor with a gas stove, coolers sat neatly along one wall, and Emily's handwritten lists had become the center of everything. She had slept less than 2 hours, yet she was back before 7, checking names and making sure every household marked need help had been contacted. Richard arrived carrying 2 large containers of coffee and a box of paper cups. His expensive shirt from the night before had been replaced by jeans and an old navy sweatshirt. "I brought these," he said. Emily looked at the coffee. "You may have just become the most popular person in Willow Creek." Richard almost smiled. That would be a first before 8 in the morning. Something between them had changed, but Emily did not pretend the previous months had disappeared overnight. Respect built in darkness still had to survive daylight. Richard placed the coffee on a table and immediately asked what needed attention. Emily pointed toward the neighborhood map. Brookfield is checked. Hawthorne is almost finished. We still need confirmation from 4 houses near the west entrance. Richard picked up the list without hesitation. 2 other neighbors volunteered to go with him. Before leaving, Richard stopped beside a couple who had just entered the pavilion. If you need anything, tell Emily Carter, he said. She has the system organized. Emily heard him. So did everyone else. Hours earlier, hearing her name from him had felt surprising. Now he said it naturally, without reducing her to her rental house or her job. By mid-morning, utility crews had cleared the blocked road, and several sections of Willow Creek had power again. The pavilion gradually became less of an emergency station and more of a gathering place. Neighbors who had lived 50 yards apart for years were introducing themselves properly for the first time. Mrs. Patterson sat drinking coffee beside Daniel, whose portable power station had kept her phone charged. Linda laughed with a couple she had never spoken to before. A family offered extra refrigerator space to another household, still waiting for electricity. Richard returned from the west entrance and stood near the doorway, watching them. Strange, he said when Emily joined him. What is? I have lived here 17 years. I know every property line, every association rule, every maintenance schedule. He looked across the pavilion. I did not know half these people needed anything. Emily folded her arms gently. Most people do not advertise what they need. You seem to notice. My work taught me to ask. Richard was quiet. Then he looked toward the folding table where her original cardboard sign still rested. At the meeting, I treated your proposal like you were trying to change what Willow Creek was. Emily met his eyes. I was. Richard seemed surprised. I wanted it to become more useful. There was no accusation in her voice, which made the words harder for him to dismiss. A neighbor approached them and asked whether the pavilion could remain open until every house had electricity again. Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at Emily first. What do you think? The question was small, but everyone close enough to hear it understood its weight. Emily glanced around the room. Keep it open. Richard nodded. Then it stays open. No vote followed. No argument began. The man who once believed authority meant deciding who belonged had finally learned that sometimes leadership meant recognizing the person who already knew what needed to be done. By early afternoon, electricity had returned to most of Willow Creek, and the neighborhood slowly began returning to its familiar rhythm. Garage doors opened, air conditioners started humming again, and porch lights blinked back to life even though daylight still filled the streets. Yet something remained different inside the pavilion. Nobody seemed eager to close it. The tables that had held batteries, water, coolers, and handwritten lists were now surrounded by neighbors drinking coffee and talking to people they had passed for years without knowing. Emily stood near the entrance, collecting and used supplies so they could be returned to their owners. She was tired, but there was satisfaction in seeing Mrs. Patterson laughing with Linda while Daniel helped another resident carry a cooler toward the parking area. No single person had saved Willow Creek. That was what mattered. One person had simply made it easier for everyone else to help. Richard stood across the room watching Emily tape the final completed list to the wall. Every house had been checked. Every request had been matched with someone willing to assist. He walked toward her slowly. Emily. She turned. Everything all right? Yes. Richard glanced at the completed list. Actually, better than all right. He paused, choosing his words with unusual care. I owe you an apology. Emily did not rescue him from the discomfort. She waited. Richard looked toward the open pavilion doors. At the dinner, I introduced you by the house you rent instead of by your name. Then I told you where you could sit because you are not a homeowner. His expression tightened with embarrassment. At the meeting, I dismissed your proposal because I assumed I understood what this neighborhood needed better than you did. Emily remained quiet. Several nearby conversations softened as people realized what was happening. Richard could have lowered his voice. Instead, he continued normally. I thought belonging here was something property could prove. Emily looked at him steadily. Belonging is something people prove. The room went quiet. Richard absorbed the words without defending himself. Then he nodded. You proved it before I did. Emily shook her head gently. This is not about proving I deserve to be here. Richard looked surprised. Then what is it about? Why did I need to prove anything at all? The question landed harder than anger would have. Richard glanced around at the neighbors who had shared supplies, checked on one another, and worked side by side through the night. You should not have, he said. Emily gave a small nod. That was enough for the moment. She did not demand a speech or public humiliation. She did not pretend one apology erased 11 months of being treated like a visitor on her own street. Respect, she knew, was not restored through a single conversation. It had to become a habit. Richard turned toward the people nearby. Before everyone leaves, I want to say something. Conversation stopped. What happened here worked because Emily Carter had a plan when the rest of us were still debating what to do. I rejected nearly the same idea 2 nights ago. A few residents exchanged uncomfortable looks. I was wrong. He looked toward Emily. And I think the board should reconsider her proposal at the next meeting. Emily glanced toward the open gate and the wet lawn beyond it. Only days earlier, that gate had represented everything Willow Creek kept separated: owners from renters, private comfort from shared responsibility, belonging from usefulness. Now it stood open while neighbors moved freely through it. Emily smiled faintly. She had never wanted Richard to lose his place in the community. She had only wanted him to understand that making room for someone else did not make his own place smaller. 3 months later, the pavilion no longer waited behind a locked gate for the rare neighborhood meeting. On the first Saturday of every month, folding tables stretched beneath its roof while Willow Creek residents carried in canned vegetables, cereal, pasta, diapers, paper goods, and other donations for the food pantry where Emily worked. The Homeowners Association had approved the program unanimously at its next meeting, but the vote was only part of what had changed. People who once hurried from their cars to their front doors now stopped to talk. Mrs. Patterson knew which neighbor could help with her phone. Daniel knew who needed an extra hand moving heavy groceries. Linda had organized a contact list for residents who lived alone. Richard had even proposed keeping a small supply of flashlights, batteries, bottled water, and basic emergency items available for future outages. Emily never called any of it her project. She called it what it had become, their neighborhood. That evening, Willow Creek held another community dinner beneath strings of warm lights on the same lawn where Emily had once stood holding peach cobbler without a place at the main table. The weather was clear, the grass was dry, and laughter drifted between the houses as families carried dishes toward the long tables. Emily arrived after finishing a shift at the pantry, wearing a simple light blue dress and carrying another peach cobbler. She stopped for half a second when she saw the seating arrangement. The memory returned quietly. Richard standing beside the table. The empty chair. His careful explanation that the seats were reserved for homeowners. Emily could have carried that moment like a debt. Instead, she had allowed what happened afterward to reveal whether anyone had truly learned from it. Richard noticed her from across the lawn. He was helping place drinks on a table rather than standing at the center of the gathering. When he saw Emily, he excused himself and walked toward her. You brought the cobbler again, he said. Mrs. Patterson threatened to complain if I did not. Richard smiled. That sounds like her. Then he turned toward the main table. Nearly every chair was occupied. One remained empty beside his own. Richard walked over, placed his hand on its back, and pulled it out. Conversations nearby softened. Emily, he said, we saved you a seat. She looked at him, then at the chair. Months earlier, he had treated that same gesture as something she had not earned because her name was not attached to a deed. Now there was no announcement about renters or homeowners. No explanation of status. Just a place at the table. Emily sat down. Mrs. Patterson immediately reached for the cobbler, while Daniel joked that everyone deserved a piece before she claimed half of it. Laughter moved along the table. Richard sat beside Emily, but he did not try to turn the moment into a ceremony. He had learned that respect mattered most when it became ordinary. As twilight deepened, Emily looked across the lawn at people sharing food, exchanging names, and making plans for the next donation drive. Willow Creek still had its large houses, polished cars, careful landscaping, and property rules. None of those things had disappeared. What had disappeared was the belief that they were what made a community valuable. Emily had never needed wealth to change Willow Creek. She had needed one brave choice, to help people who had barely noticed her, without demanding that they deserve her kindness first. And that evening, beneath the same warm lights where she had once been left at the edge, nobody asked whether Emily Carter belonged there. They finally understood that belonging was never about owning a place. It was about making room for others within it.